Awesome. Really
Cool. Right, thank you for coming. How's your workshop so far?
good. Very good.
Fantastic. There's a lot of content to take in. So this is the last one. We'll have a nice recharge, rest up before the afternoon workshop. Cool. So we're privileged enough to have Ben here. Ben's an IP partner at Knights, which is one of the largest law firms in the UK, where they act as a household name for brands and innovative startups. Ben focuses on helping businesses to realise their value in IP, especially brands, and Ben sits on a committee with a US-based international trademark association. So the session will bust some IP myths, providing practical examples of things businesses can do to maximise their investment in marketing and brand. And along the theme, I was asking all the speakers for interesting facts about themselves, and I'm curious to hear more. Ben once swam with sharks, but not intentionally. Ben, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. It's great to see so many familiar faces and some new ones as well. For the introduction, I'm an intellectual property lawyer, so I'm not a creative, I'm not a marketer, but I spend my time advising brands and on marketing law issues day in, day out. And a lot of the focus is about how businesses can generate value in trademarks in their advertising work. There tends to be a perception that what the lawyers are about is perhaps sharpening their elbows and keeping competition at bay, stopping people infringing brands and those sorts of things. And of course, that's a part of it, but there's so much more to it as well. Where it really works is where brand is used as a tool to add value. And I use the terms brand and trademarks interchangeably, if you'll forgive me. So from my point of view, this conference could be called Building Trademarks. As lawyers, we talk about trademarks, but essentially what we mean is brands, and I'll probably flip between the two as we go. I put forward a suggestion which I think probably is not too unpopular in this room, that brand is probably, and the work that the marketing teams do, is probably the most important element of any business, no matter whether it's a service business, a product business, B2B or B2C. Up here we've got two categories of assets, if you like, which influence the future success or otherwise of a business. Many businesses are used to valuing the assets on this list: buildings, the products that they sell, the machinery that they've got to make their widgets, the staff, likes to call staff assets, but they go on the balance sheet, the work of the professional advisors, the fleet of vehicles that they run, and all these other things. Businesses are used to adding up the value of these, working out what they're going to add to the business in the longer term. But they often forget all of this stuff. There is none of this stuff, reputation, legacy, marketing, without these things. Of course there isn't. There needs to be some substance behind it. But this, I believe, has the much longer legacy, has the much bigger tail, if you like. You could replace everything on this list, the buildings, the staff, the products, and you'd still have a legacy, a reputation, and a brand, and so on. And businesses often forget that. For an example, I read somewhere recently that Porsche, the car company, they were saying that their marketing life cycle is about 50 years. So from when they first appeal to kids through PlayStation games or Matchbox toys or whatever it is, through to the point in life where somebody might actually buy one of these things. If somebody has had that exposure to the Porsche brand 50 years ago, the car they go and buy tomorrow, it's not going to be the same car. The product has changed. The buildings that have produced it, the staff and everything else has changed, but the brand is consistent. So we distill everything, that was on that previous slide, back down to brand. And I think the work of the marketers and the brand creation agencies and everybody else in that space has the biggest impact on the long-term legacy of businesses we engage with. A couple more examples up here. So a couple of brands over here. You can no longer go into a Woolworths on the high street. You can no longer buy a Saab, but you know what those brands are. Everything else has fallen away. If you wanted to go and call your new shop Woolworths, or you wanted to call your new car Saab, you wouldn't be able to. Even though the rest of the infrastructure is gone, the brand lives on. And I think there's often a myth around intellectual property and patents and technology, and that in order to care about intellectual property, you've got to have people in lab coats pipetting things from one place to another. But it's only really those high-tech, geeky businesses that really need to worry about intellectual property. And part of that is because people talk about patents all the time. They talk about copyright all the time. They talk about design rights all the time. And those things have their part to play. Patents, designs, copyrights, not going to talk about them today, but they protect the way things work. They protect the way widgets work. They protect the way things look, fashion items or whatever it might be. But again, I would suggest that brand is the more important of any of those and has the higher value compared to any of those when you look at the balance sheet of a business. In one of the talks earlier, Gemma from Chalk and Ward mentioned Apple and asked for and I made a note of them, the words that came to mind when you think of Apple. and I don't mind me repeating them back, but people said premium, slick, creative, leader in what they do. And I suggest that it's all of those things, if you're an Apple user, that influence the choice of smartphone that you use, not how many patents it's got or how many widgets it's got or how fast the processor is. You took all of that for granted because you knew what you were getting into when you invested in that brand. So, we're going to talk also a little bit about some of the new technological frontiers that brands are facing at the moment. Brands create, or have, I should say, lots of opportunities, but wherever there's an opportunity, there's also a risk, there's also a challenge. I'm a lawyer, right? So I'm always going to talk about risk and balancing that with opportunities. We'll come back to these in more detail later, but brand has the ability to give businesses the edge in the marketplace that we're looking at here with all of these technologies. Of course, there are loads more technologies we could talk about, but those are the ones that we'll touch on a little bit more. Before we talk about that, though, I think I would like to go back a step. In order to understand how brands can thrive in the future, we need to go back a little bit and understand about how brands work from a legal point of view, from a trademark point of view. So, here's a couple of examples of the very earliest brands. We've got, obviously, here, a brand, as in the literal sense, a brand on a head of cattle to tell a purchaser where that head of cattle came from, and over time to educate the purchaser that that rancher looks after their cattle well, so it's going to be a good product. And we've got brands on crates over here to identify where product came from, if it came in from overseas, for example. In both of those instances, the uniting factor is that the brand in those instances is acting as what we call a badge of origin. So it's informing the consumer of where the products come from. It's not talking about anything to do with brand in the modern context. It's just talking about where did this stuff come from, a badge of origin. And lawyers, we still use the phrase badge of origin. In order to be a brand, in order to be a trademark, in order to generate revenue, a brand has to, what's called, be a badge of origin. And that means that it has to be sufficient to educate consumers that if they see a product with that name on it, or they buy a service with that name on it, they with certainty know that it comes from a certain place. So, for example, if you buy a bottle of Pepsi in Exeter, or you buy a bottle of Pepsi in Singapore, you know what's in that bottle. You've been educated as a consumer what that brand is doing. So very much in the early day of brand was not about what brand could do for the business, but it was what brand could do for the consumers. It was about educating those consumers that that product, that head of cattle, whatever's inside those crates, came from a certain supplier. And as such, brand was operating as a shorthand for trust. You didn't necessarily know the rancher, you didn't necessarily know who had packed the stuff into the boxes, but it was operating as a shorthand for trust. We then see an evolution. Here we've got brand acting for the consumer. What can brand do for the consumer? We can give them reassurances about the origin of products. And we then move to what can brand do for the business? Well, it can start to be used as a marketing tool. And that's the first evolution that we as lawyers recognise. You tick the box to say something can be done as a badge of origin. Something can act as a badge of origin. It can tell you where that product came from. But now we move into what can it do for the business. It can educate the business about what you do. It can spread the message about that trust. We then have another evolution, which is where we have very overt marketing. You look back at examples of marketing now from generations ago, and they are so open that they're laughable compared to what we do now. Perhaps people think they're unsophisticated compared to what we do now, but the real shift has been away from an overt advertising, buy our product because it's good, through to a much more covert form of advertising, where you don't necessarily feel that you're being advertised to at all. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more. The last talk, for those of you who are in this room, talking about influencers, and the speakers there, we're talking about what is really the peak at the moment of covert advertising, influencer arrangements. I don't use covert as a sort of negative term. I just think it reflects the way that consumers don't necessarily feel how they're being advertised to. So a couple of evolutions. Brand used to act purely for the business benefit of the customer. Now brand acts for the benefit of the business. The customer, though, still needs to have trust in that brand. Remember, the trademark acts as a shorthand for trust. And in order for there to be that trust, there needs to be all sorts of regulation, there needs to be all sorts of controls on how a business uses their brand going forward. And those controls become more important, they become more rigid, the more covert the advertising becomes. So the less somebody feels they're being advertised to, the more the law says, well, you've got to protect them. You've got to make sure that it's clear that they're being advertised to. and so on. And we have people like the Advertising Standards Authority that look after that. So, as we see more emerging tech, we have a real tension between these two aims of brand. On the one hand, protecting the business, keeping competitors at bay, stopping counterfeiters, giving you control over your reputation, adding value to the balance sheet, but also protecting the consumer, so that when they buy a bottle of Pepsi, they bought one in Exeter, they bought one in Singapore, now they're going to buy one in Taunton, they want to know that it's the same thing. So we've got this inherent tension. I said earlier about this conference could be called Building Trademarks, as far as I'm sort of concerned, coming at it from a legal angle. And that's because trademark registrations are the way in which the law protects brands. They're the way in which the law gives businesses ownership of brands. Trademarks come in two varieties, really, unregistered and registered. Unregistered trademarks, not worth really bothering with. They don't add value to the business, they don't give you control, they don't give you title to an asset which you can move around in the same way. Trademark registration, on the other hand, is a monopoly, a bit like owning title deeds to a piece of land, where you can say, this is my brand, this is my turf. Nobody else can come onto that turf without me setting the rules for entry, whether that's payment or license terms or an influencer using it and taking it further forward for you. But it's also about adding value, because a bit like, again, having title deeds to a piece of land, it creates an asset which you can have valued, which you can sell, which you can license, and all those sorts of things. So for those working in marketing, for those working in brand, from a legal point of view, the real impetus is to be thinking about getting registrations through for those marks so that you can own them. Not only does that give you control, but the flip side of that is that businesses who don't register their trademarks are giving away value. Every day people go to work, whether you're creating brands for other people, whether you're working in-house, every day the work that you do is building legacy, it's building reputation, it's building value. If you don't obtain a registration to ring fence and take ownership of that, then that time is, in effect, being wasted because you're not generating something which you can own or which you can control. So having said that people should get registrations, the next thing to talk about is, well, what does that mean? Well, not everything is registrable. So this is my next challenge to a lot of businesses that I speak with, is choosing a brand which they can get a registration for. And on this column here, we've got some examples of things which can't be registered. The first one of those is descriptive marks. So a trademark which is descriptive can't be registered because the government would say it's not fair that you have a monopoly in that phrase. So I couldn't get a registration for what I do. I couldn't get a registration for law firm because they would say, well, everybody that's a lawyer should be able to call themselves law firm. But Knights we can get a registration for because that doesn't in any way describe what we do. And this is a really difficult challenge, particularly for startup businesses, because often the impetus in the early days is to educate people what they do. So I speak to lots of marketing teams and they say, well, we've called it law firm, to carry on my slightly ridiculous example, because it educates consumers of what we do. Why make life difficult for ourselves by calling it Knights and then having to say, oh yeah, by the way, this is what we do. And obviously that makes sense from a marketing point of view, but in the longer term, it doesn't make any sense because you're generating, or you're trying to generate value in a brand which you can't own. So very early on, making sure that you've got a brand which is not descriptive of what you do is really important. Thinking again about marks which don't infringe earlier rights is really important. And this might be nationally, it might be internationally. Lots of businesses start small in the UK, for example, and then run into issues when they start to trade overseas and they find that somebody else has got a registration for the mark that they want to use. It doesn't have to be a registration for the same mark. A registration for a similar mark can also be a problem. So we've got Knights with a K. If somebody else had got Knights with an N, that would be an issue, potentially. So thinking about whether or not your mark is too close to somebody else's is really important as well. And the earlier in a business life cycle, painful though it is, these issues can be dealt with. Even if it means starting again and rebranding, the better it's going to be in 4 or 5 years' time when the business says, right, now we want to sell, or now we want to license this brand, or now we want to realise this value in this brand in some other way, or now we want to sharpen our elbows and stop this infringer that's coming over the hill with a similar brand and challenging us. None of those things are possible unless we've got these registrations in place. Worth, I think, just a moment on what counts as an infringement, because that also confuses people. In essence, when trademarks, remember, protecting consumers, a badge of origin, protecting the consumers about the source of the goods and services that they buy. So what you're looking for, or what you're trying to avoid, is a risk of confusion on the part of the consumer. So imagine yourself walking down the aisle of a supermarket. It's a Saturday morning. You'd rather be doing 101 other things than in a supermarket on a Saturday morning. And you pick up a product. Maybe it's, I don't know, it's a tub of butter or something. And you look at it, you look at the branding on it, you put it back. You don't buy it. You get on with your life. You leave. And you go down a few aisles more. And you see another product. Maybe it's a similar price, a dairy product, but this time it's ice cream. So it's not a, you don't choose, am I going to have butter today or am I going to have ice cream? But they're still dairy products. They're still sort of in the same sort of ballpark. Again, you don't buy it, you put it down, you get on with your life. A couple of days later, for whatever reason, you're thinking about that interaction in the supermarket and you think, without the benefit of perfect recollection, you've got those two products in front of you. Do you think there's a risk that the product came from the same organisation or was somehow commercially linked to the same organisation? And that could be because the marks are similar, it could be because they're visually the same, it could be that phonetically they're same, it could even be conceptually they're same. So if both of these products are named after two types of plants, for example, that conceptual similarity could be a problem. So when choosing a brand or when working with a brand owner, have a think about those issues really early on, because all that investment, again, could be wasted if we're just going to end up with a mark which is potentially similar. The others I won't talk about too much, but non-distinctive marks are marks which aren't capable of educating the consumer about where the product came from. So something like Have a Break. Nestle have been trying to get that registered for Kit Kat for about 20 years and they haven't been able to because the government says, well, it doesn't educate people of where this thing comes from. It's a slogan, it's a strapline, it doesn't educate people about origin. Offensive marks, don't really need to say much more about that. Some sectors, like alcohol, have really strict regulations on what you can use as a brand, whether that's logo or the name of the product and all the rest of it. So some of those industries have specific things. But there are obviously things you can do. So clearance searches, the UK Intellectual Property Office is the government website that looks after all these things. You can go on there, you can do some searches, there's some free text boxes where you can search for marks and see whether or not somebody's already got a registration or a similar registration for what you're doing. You can have a look at the Advertising Standards Authority website and make sure that there are no lists that are blocking things like, for example, alcohol. You can have a look at making sure also that when you're comparing other people's marks or when you're thinking about protecting your own mark, you use the right specification, you protect the right goods and services. A little bit on that, I think, just for trademark law purposes, there are 45 different classes, and each class covers a different range of goods and services. I'm still waiting for this to come up in a pub quiz. At some point, it's got to. But if anybody wants to do a pub quiz later on which of the 45 classes of things are in, now there's not a great amount of logic to this. So class 9, for example, covers fire escape ladders, but also computer software. So I could do this all day, but I'm not going to. It's really important when you file an application, you file it in the right class, which sounds daft. But so many times we see brands and they say, yeah, we've got it registered, we're not worried about it. And they are a software provider and they've got themselves covered for software, but they haven't got themselves covered what the software actually does, for example, an obvious sort of thing. And then registering the right mark. So again, having to think about how your mark is going to be used in trade. So many people will register the logos, but not the word mark. Trademarks can be word marks, they can be logos, they can be smells, they can be jingles like you see on TV, they can be things like the shape of Toblerone. They can be all sorts of different things as long as they're capable of acting as that badge of origin. So spending some time to make sure that not only you're registering something, but you're registering the right thing. Because otherwise it's like trying to buy a plot of land and you've drawn the wrong space on the map, wasting everybody's time. So, there we go. Choose a mark you can register and register it. I think that's really important. And to further press home the point, this is the flip side of what I was saying earlier about the benefits of trademark registration. A trademark registration is an asset. It can add to the value of the business. It can be recognised on the balance sheet. The trademark registration gives you the ability to stop people from ripping you off. If you don't register it, then you're facilitating copycats. I always think, and I don't know whether this is fair or not, but I always think if a business hasn't registered the mark or they've registered the wrong right, they're being a bit short-term. Because why wouldn't you worry about your legacy? Why wouldn't you worry about what's going to happen in 5 years' time unless you're not really planning on being around? Why also give people the opportunity to have influence over your brand that you spent so long working up? If you want to control how people are using your brand on social media, and I don't mean control in sort of a negative way and shutting up bad reviews and all those sorts of things, but I mean controlling your voice, controlling your message. All of these things come through, again, trademark registration. Okay, so I spoke earlier about two forms of evolution we've seen so far in the brand space. We've seen an evolution away from trademarks just acting as a badge of origin. So what can trademarks do for consumers? They can educate you about where the product comes from. We saw an evolution to what can brand do for businesses. It can act as a marketing tool. And we're now seeing a third evolution, I think, which, funnily enough, brings us full circle back to trademarks acting as a shortcut for trust. So technology, and we'll talk about technology a little bit more in a moment, is breaking down traditional sales models. I don't think that's controversial. On the one side, we've got the traditional way of doing business, particularly in a B2C sort of environment. It's face-to-face. You maybe pick up the product. You maybe get to know the salesperson, that sort of stuff, all the way over to what we do now when we sort of don't necessarily have personal recommendations. We're looking online and things like that. Certainly, I think about my car buying experience. I bought my last car online. It was much more streamlined than going and haggling in the showroom and all those sorts of things. But the experience was very different, and I was basing my choice on reviews, on videos, rather than test drives and all those sorts of things, and what a friend might have told me would be suitable. So we're seeing this evolution, breaking down the relationship, I think, the traditional relationship selling model, away to one where brand has even more power to influence purchasing decision. But again, in order for brand to influence purchasing decision, you've got to own the thing, you've got to get the trademark through. Done right then, technology plays into all of this. So all those things I mentioned earlier about AI, around voice search and that sort of stuff, it all plays into this side of the slide. But again, labelling the point, if we don't own the trademark, then we can't necessarily take advantage of these things in the same way. So here again is that list of 4 emerging techs, which I think are shaking things up for brands at the moment. We'll go into them in slightly more detail in a moment. But we are, in effect, coming back to this tension between the responsibility to protect businesses and the responsibility to protect consumers. That balance that trademarks try to balance, and a tightrope they try to walk. So let's have a look at artificial intelligence to start with, because why not? That's the trend, isn't it? Everyone wants to talk about AI. There's lots of stuff to talk about. We could talk about, I won't. But from a legal point of view, this slide sums up some of the key things that we're being asked around at the moment when it comes to artificial intelligence. So this is still a brand issue, because getting these things wrong has a huge impact on reputation, and of course brand, trademarks, it's all about reputation. We're seeing issues around copyright both for people who are using these tools, and those tools have consumed content of third parties, perhaps without permission. So if you say to an AI algorithm, write me a song that sounds like Coldplay, the only reason it knows what Coldplay sounds like is because it's consumed all of Coldplay's back catalogue, and it probably hasn't paid a license fee in order to do so. So we're starting to see some actions being taken by copyright owners, not Coldplay, but others, as far as I know anyway, to challenge some of these AI tools at the moment. We're also seeing it the other way around, where people are uploading employer data or employee data or other businesses' sensitive data to artificial intelligence tools and saying, make the decision for me. Samsung have recently changed their policy on this because some coders trying to be smart and find a shortcut to something just uploaded proprietary Samsung code. It's now obviously in the public domain. People can see it. People can stand on the shoulders of that earlier innovation. So we're starting to see some issues around that. Some of the other issues, which we won't go into too much because it's a little bit of a tangent, but we're starting to see businesses being more concerned, as they should be, about bias in artificial intelligence. There are protections for consumers around artificial intelligence being used to make decisions. There's cases, for example, where courts use artificial intelligence algorithms to decide whether somebody gets bail or not, and how people feel about that. But there are issues, again, there with the transparency of that technology. If you're refused bail and you say, tell me the reason why I was refused bail, and the AI owner says, well, I'm not, because that's my code, I'm not going to tell you how my code works, you're kind of stuck in the middle. Coming full circle again, we're starting to see AI as a creator, generating content and potentially even influencing consumer purchasing decisions. And again, that leads us full circle back to brands. So we've heard, certainly in the last Building Brands conference in Plymouth, we heard about new online search methods influencing customer behaviour, for example, where somebody might, might go into a search engine and say, tell me about, I don't know, sports cars. And whereas previously you've got a list of websites that you could have gone to and you would have looked at whichever brands it was, the tools are now saying, this is the thing we think you'll like, and you can see it there without going into the website environment that the car manufacturer, or whatever brand or product you like to think about, has created for you. So as brand owners would have had that nicely curated space, that website where you land and they control your journey, That's starting to be taken away through the use of AI tools in search engine optimization. Again, brand gives you the ability to control how those search engines use that and helps you to control your voice. We're seeing that with product comparisons as well. So in this example, not just saying this is the thing we think you like, but where it'll say we think you like this one and we think you like this one. There are really strict rules on comparative advertising and how you can compare products. AI isn't complying with those rules generally at the moment. I won't talk about data protection, so if I do, I think everybody would quite rightly say enough already. But people uploading customer databases to AI tools is a real issue that we're seeing at the moment. Really powerful, but have we got necessary permissions to do so? Probably not. And I think my take home from the way the law is treating AI at the moment is that AI is being treated as a tool, just like any other tool, just like a calculator, as Ollie from Agile Communications mentioned it earlier. Any tool is only as good as the way you use it, who's using it, the training they've had, and all the rest of it. So if somebody walked down the high street and smashed a shop window with a hammer, you wouldn't go after the hammer manufacturer. If there was a fault with the hammer that caused it, then maybe you would. But otherwise, you go after the person that uses the tool. They're the person responsible. And it's exactly the same here with AI. A lot of people are trying to have slopey shoulders about liability. But brands will stand or fall by the way they embrace this technology. Consumers will remember what they did. Next technology I want to talk about is voice search. And again, this is something that we've seen starting to really interest clients a little bit more. So obviously, voice search here, you don't type in anything. You don't have the benefit of logos. So you're using a brand as a simple word. Another reason why businesses should look at getting their names, their company names, their domain names, not just their logos registered as trademarks. Because what you're starting to see is what's called a bait and switch, where somebody says, tell me details about brand A. Somebody else has registered the details of brand A with the voice search provider. So what you get is not brand A, but it's brand B. There was a case of ages ago which illustrates this, not voice search, but it was in the States. Somebody had put billboards up at the side of a highway in America saying Blockbuster video hire 2 miles down the road or whatever. And then there was another one saying you're only a mile now from Blockbuster. And then the next junction said turn up here to go to Blockbuster for your video rentals. And you got there and there was no Blockbuster, but there was a Joe's Video Shack. And a sign that said, sorry, there's no Blockbuster, but whilst you're here, you might as well. It's exactly the same stuff that's happening, but through technology. And the way to control that, again, is to take ownership of the brand, take ownership of the voice, and make sure that people know it's genuine content when you hear that through. We're also seeing tension from voiceover artists. Generally speaking, the technology is not pro-creative, it's the regulation is not pro-creative, it's pro-technology at the moment. So that's having an impact. And again, going back to this idea of personal recommendations, on voice search, people seem to have a more trust built in with their voice search assistant device, whatever it may be, which seems a bit weird, but it seems that they do. Again, something may have been in the last talk about influencers. I think influencer arrangements are becoming the peak of what we have at the moment anyway for this concept of covert advertising. And as a result, there's lots of controls around what brands should and shouldn't do when they use influencer marketers. Firstly, own your trademark, because otherwise you're saying to somebody, here, use this, and you don't actually use it, so you can't license it to them in the first place. But you are, in practical terms, handing over control of the brand, so making sure you know what they're going to say, making sure that they're on message is going to be really important. And again, there's a long tail to this stuff if it goes wrong. The conversational feel of social media is one of the reasons why it works, but the regulators want you to not take away from that conversational feel, but to make it clear that this is an advert, this is something that is being put to you because there's a commercial relationship somewhere between the brand and the influencer. So that really needs to be addressed, usually overtly, in this otherwise covert marketing communication. Think also about who's going to own the content. If stuff does go viral, who's going to come out better, the brand or the influencer? Hopefully it's going to be a win-win for everybody. But unless you've got these agreements in place, and of course I'm a lawyer, so written agreements, I'm always going to suggest written agreements to control what happens when you hand your brand over to somebody else and entrust them to take it out into the web. The last new tech that, again, I think, going back to that theme of opportunities and risks for brands, is around deep fakes. So the stuff that gets the press on this is more to do with celebrity lookalikes and all those sorts of things. But we're seeing the same issues on things like counterfeit products. It's much easier to make counterfeit products than it has been previously. It's easier to get details about the products that you want to imitate, and it's easier to use AI to say, create something that looks like this, or create something that performs this function, which then competes with established technology or competes with established brands. So having a think about how we control those counterfeits, those lookalike products and things like that online is something that, again, trademarks really help with, and where I think there's a real vulnerability for businesses at the moment because it's becoming so much easier to do so. Also, there's an increasing, it's always been increasing, tendency for people to, as consumers, not feel so guilty about what they're doing online. Perhaps they wouldn't go to a market and buy a fake, whatever it is, but they might well go online and buy something that looks like it's not necessarily real, but it's a lookalike type product and all those sorts of things. I think there's some really interesting questions for luxury brands in this space as well, where it seems like there's a shift away from people wanting products that they perhaps think they should want, or that the concerns about status are driving. So I'm going to buy this product because that makes certain signals about me as a purchaser, through to solutions, goods and services which are more tailored for the individual. And if you're placing value on something that's more tailored, that's right for you, rather than what other people think is right for you, definite trend we're seeing, luxury brands start to struggle with that. We're starting to see this sort of quiet luxury trend, which I think is part of the answer to that, where perhaps the logos and all those things aren't quite so overt on fashion goods and that sort of thing. So where does all of that leave us? As I say, we've got this evolution, but it's left us not with a wholly new solution or new creation, but it's left us with a balance. Badge of origin, trust, versus the ability to market and to use technology to influence consumer behaviour, but within the realms of the regulation. In order to even use those tools, it's a given we need to be using our trademark registrations and having a look back whether or not we've registered the right thing, whether or not there are things we should be registering, and so on. And once we have registered them, we can treat them like any other asset. So just like, a building, you can buy it, you can sell it, you can lease it, you can give it away, you can let somebody use a part of it, but not other parts of it. Those things become possible through this registration system. Where does all of this leave us again for technology? Well, I think it leaves us with a growing importance on emotional intelligence. And I think that we will see clients of law firms looking for emotional intelligence. I think we will see employers valuing emotional intelligence when they employ people. And I think we will see people who instruct brand agencies and marketing agencies looking at the emotional intelligence that's on offer, not just the technological solutions. If I take that back to my world and talking about lawyers, clients don't pay me to make sure the commas are in the right place in the contract. AI can do that. What they care about is making sure that the advice is tailored to them and their risk profile and everything else. And it's exactly the same when we look at that in a brand and marketing perspective. I think one of the things that brand and marketing are really good at is this sense of narrative, creating a narrative. Brand is, of course, all about narrative. People buy products, they buy into that narrative. How does this make me fit into that story? What does it say about me? Artificial intelligence is terrible at narrative at the moment. And so the real value being placed on narrative, emotional intelligence. How do we tell stories through brand? How do we tell stories as lawyers, making sure that the cases are presented in a way which makes sense to people going forward? Another example I would use here is of music, where I said earlier about an artificial intelligence tool might be able to make a song that sounds like a Coldplay song. I don't know why I'm picking on Coldplay. It could be anybody. I think people are probably less likely to want to listen to music that's being created by AI at the moment if they know it's being created by AI, because I think part of the creative dialogue, if you like, whether it's music or film or literature, whatever it might be, is this concept of shared human experience. You hear a song, you read a book or whatever it is, and you think somebody else has been there before, somebody else has got something that they can teach me. And if you know that that's a sham, it's actually a technology that's created that work, I think that takes away from the emotional engagement for now. And I think it's also exactly the same with brand. That human connection, that using these tools to create relationships is where the future lies. So, thank you very much. Happy to take any questions if anyone's got any.
We've got about 5 minutes for questions.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You talked about AI as a tool and the responsibility being in the hands of the person using the tool. Is that also then true for the ownership of IP of something created with AI? Say an image, a bit of video, some music. Is the ownership of the IP also in the hands of the user?
Probably not. So all of the law around creation of intellectual property assumes that a human is doing the creating. So we haven't got any law that says what happens at the moment if an AI does it. But the way the AI tools are getting around it is through contract. So the terms and conditions that nobody bothers reading, because life's too short, will say who owns the IP here. And we saw this 20 years ago with social media, where people, including some huge businesses, were giving away intellectual property to the social media platforms, including core IP in brands and all sorts of stuff, because they didn't read the terms and conditions. In the end, nobody had the nerve to rely on any of those clauses, and the world just carried on. But it feels like we're in the same space now. So it depends what's in the T's and C's. Short answer. Hi.
Hi, so an advertising-specific question. So if the brand is developing a kind of a new positioning, new brand strategy, new brand idea, and there's going to be a new campaign that will be expressed in everything it does, is there a kind of like, which elements of that should we be looking to protect, if any?
Yeah.
And I'm curious about your point about origin. Like, so do you have to build in some sort of brand-specific element into it in order to make it representative?
So, to take the question in order, so the different elements, if you take somebody like Nike, Nike will have registrations for the swoosh, they'll have registrations for the word Nike, they'll have registrations for Just Do It, they'll have registrations for Air, they'll have registrations then for things that combine all of those different things together. You've then got things like non-traditional trademarks, can't think of any from Nike, but things like purple for Cadbury's. If you wanted to sell chocolate, you wouldn't be able to put it in a purple wrapper, because Cadbury's owned that. Back in the day, orange for telecoms, they had that. So those colour schemes can be important. Direct Line used to have the jingle that they had on TV registered. So anything which acts as a influencer, this is not the commercial answer, this is the legal answer, anything that acts as an influencer of consumer buying decisions, it has the potential to be a trademark, as long as they have access to it before they purchase, and as long as it's something which might sway their decision.
So if it becomes a sort of a fairly colloquial piece of language, and you're introducing it for the first time attached to your brand,
Yeah.
how do you establish that it is connected to your brand? So I'm curious why Kit Kat can't, very famous long-running
Yeah.
break. You'd think that was as well connected to that brand as it comes.
Yep.
So how do you establish that you've got some sort of ownership over that language?
So, one way of doing it is simply to put an application in. It takes about 4 to 6 months.
Right.
So build that in early enough into the process, and hopefully you've got the registration certificate in your hands before you've launched the thing. But the test is always, would a consumer see this as a badge of origin? So Kit Kat, very clearly a badge of origin, because it doesn't mean anything necessarily, and you see it there, and it's got this nice logo, and you know exactly what it is. The argument against Have a Break would be that if somebody else had a chocolate bar and they had Have a Break on it, you might think, actually, I've earned a break, I'm going to have a biscuit, or I'm going to have a chocolate bar, or whatever it is, because it's not a brand in the same way. Other examples, it's not a science, so Every Little Helps, Tesco's, I don't even know if they still use that, they have been able to get that through, for example. They have.
They have, okay.
Yeah, so it's not a science.
So it's curious, isn't it? So
It is.
I guess my take-out is it's impossible to predict. You just have to kind of go through the process. Because I kind of Just Do It feels like a colloquial expression of encouragement.
Yeah.
Every Little Helps is a colloquial expression before Tesco's adopted it.
Yeah.
Have a Break is a colloquial expression before they adopted it, and yet some have been registered and some haven't.
Yeah, and it's so you have objective rules which are applied subjectively. So you end up with cases landing on in different ways. And they've all got their own nuances, of course they have. But the easiest way is to stick an application in and see. And if you're breaking down those elements, it would be always start with the word mark. So what are we going to call this thing? Plain font. Let's try and get that registered. Then we'll worry about the logo. Then we'll worry about all the other sort of ancillary things, whether it's colour schemes and all of those sorts of things. But that would be the order I would take those elements in. And lots of people skip the first one. They don't register the word, but they register the logo, which is a key gap, really.
Got time for one more question?
Can you take us? Hi.
So, maybe slightly off topic, but recently we've seen these adverts like Andrew Marr advertising Bitcoin, but he's got nothing to do with it. So someone's taken his identity and they've used it in an illegal ad, they put it on social media. Where is there a responsibility for the media to actually start stopping this? How do you stop that? How do you, from a law point of view, where's the point of attack?
So there are a couple of points of attack. One would be the consumer protection regulations. Bitcoin not being regulated, that doesn't necessarily help. But generally speaking, there are provisions around not misleading consumers that you could rely upon. The sanctions for that aren't great, so the sorts of people that are running those sorts of ads probably don't really, they've got other things to worry about. The other issue that we have in the UK is that there aren't any real personal image rights. So unless an individual or a celebrity is well known in a certain sphere, it's very difficult for them to stop their content being used. So if you're a musician or a TV presenter or a sports star, then again you will register your name, your likeness as a trademark, because that's the nearest that we have in the UK. And in the absence of that, it can be really difficult. There were cases, again, probably 20 years ago, where somebody had their photo taken, they were at a party, they were holding a glass up in their hand, they were having a good time. That went on social media. And coming back to the point we spoke about earlier with the terms and conditions being really important, one of their friends went travelling, I think they were in Australia, and they messaged back to their friend and said, hey, how come you're the face of Mobile Phone Company Australia, whatever they're called? They said, I don't know what you're talking about. And they sent a photo back, and there were bus stops with them. And instead of holding up a glass, they photoshopped in a camera. Sorry, not a camera, a mobile phone. So they were using them without royalties as an image for this thing, which happens quite a bit. Less so now because it's more ethically frowned upon. But it's a really difficult thing to stop. It's a short answer.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.